Hey everyone, my name is Nathan, and today we'll be exploring alternate timelines in American history. From the founding of our nation to its near destruction, let's take a look at the key what-ifs of history. For our first what-if, we have the 1759 Battle of Quebec. This battle was a crushing blow for the French that led to their defeat in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. This French defeat against the British cost France their foothold in present-day Canada, and many of France's allies negotiated peace treaties with Britain and its ally Prussia as a result. When France officially lost the war in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, Britain earned many global territories that secured their title as a world power. But what if Britain was not so successful? What if France had successfully defended the city of Quebec against British invaders in 1759? The British had to scale the cliffs over the city of Quebec, and this gave France a very good defensive position. If France had the firepower to hold back the British, then the Battle of Quebec could have ended in a French victory. This would have greatly increased French morale, and this would have rallied French allies to extend greater support against the British. A victory of the Battle of Quebec may have led to a French victory during the 7 Years' War, and France would have become a dominating global power. France would have control over territories such as the 13 colonies, and this video would probably be in French. France would have taken control of foreign lands like India, and events such as the French Revolution would never have happened because of the prosperity that comes with being a global superpower. France would have ruled supreme. Next up, we have the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a win for the British during the American Revolutionary War, because they were able to push the rebel colonists off of the hill. But at what cost? The American colonists inflicted heavy losses on the British, with approximately 200 dead and 800 injured. The colonists, on the other hand, suffered only 400 casualties. The battle provided the colonists with a great boost in confidence. The colonists were able to rally at the Siege of Boston, as George Washington successfully led the colonial militia to retake Boston from the British. The Battle of Bunker Hill marked only the beginning of a war that would drag on for 7 more years, but it was significant in proving the colonists' ability and will to fight. So let's change that. The British, with their superior numbers, training, and supplies, could have obliterated the rebel colonists at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The only thing holding the colonists together was their sense of patriotism. And if the Battle of Bunker Hill ended with a colonial slaughter instead of British one, then the colonists would have lost their will to fight. Even the great George Washington could not have inspired the locals after witnessing such butchering of their brethren. With the Minutemen militia in tatters and other rebel groups scared into hiding, the British would have established their foothold in Boston and proceeded to stomp out nearby rebel groups. Such a colonial loss could have crippled their ability to fight the British, and the American Revolutionary War may have ended in a British victory. King George would have executed all the rebel leaders, much like he did against Scottish rebels in 1747. The colonists would have been forced to pay for the damages of the Revolutionary War, and Britain's grip on the 13 colonies would have tightened. There would have been no Louisiana Purchase, no Mexican-American War, and no Civil War. Speaking of the Civil War, our next historical event is the 1861 Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run marked the first major land battle during the American Civil War. The North, eager to quell the Confederate rebellion that began only 2 months prior, launched the offensive against the South along the river of Bull Run. Wealthy Northern spectators even gathered to watch what they thought would be a fun show. Unfortunately for the spectators, the battle soon became a bloodbath. Thousands of Confederates unleashed their famous rebel yell as they launched a counterattack against the Union line. The deafening chaos of the charging Graybacks quickly sent the Union into a mass rout. As the Union forces hurried back to Washington, D.C. to lick their wounds, the Confederate troops returned to their camps to celebrate a great victory. The war would be dragged on for 4 more years. But it could have ended right there. Bull Run was only 25 miles from Washington, D.C., and the Confederacy held the upper hand in the aftermath of the Battle of Bull Run. The Confederate troops, numbering over 30,000 strong, could have chased the fleeing Union boys and marched right into the capital of the North. Capturing Washington, D.C. would have set the Confederacy up in a strong position to launch an offensive against the rest of the North, and such a capture would have also been a huge blow on the morale of the already beaten Union forces. The Confederacy could have unified the North and South under the Confederate flag. Slavery would have been kept in place for many more decades, and the Confederacy may have fallen behind in industrialization due to their focus on agriculture. Slavery would have still eventually been ended due to foreign pressure, but prejudice and segregation may have continued to this day. But enough of this 19th century nonsense. Let's talk about something more recent. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was the first direct Japanese assault on American soil. Japan saw America as a threat to Japan's plan for expansion in the Pacific, and the unprepared forces at Pearl Harbor were easy targets. Over 2,000 Americans perished during the slaughter. Nearly 20 naval vessels were destroyed, including 8 battleships, and more than 300 planes were blown to pieces. The United States had remained officially neutral in World War II up until Pearl Harbor, but the attack rallied determined citizens across the nation to enter the war and avenge their fallen brethren. Japan's ally, Nazi Germany, soon declared war on the United States as well, and the United States officially began their involvement in both the European and Pacific theaters of the war. The United States, along with help from England and the Soviet Union, would go on to win both theaters and contribute to the reconstruction of countries ravaged by the war. And yet, this victory could have easily never happened. Admiral Yamamoto of the Japanese Navy warned the Japanese government that the attack on Pearl Harbor would awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. He was not wrong. Just 7 months after the attack, the United States managed to turn the tide of the war against Japan during the Battle of Midway. If Japan had heeded Yamamoto's words, Japan could have spent more time placing themselves in a more favorable position against America. If Japan had taken the American-held Philippine Islands before Pearl Harbor, then the American reaction would have been less significant, and Japan could have assembled more airfields to prepare for the arrival of the United States Pacific Fleet. Japan would have likely still lost the war because plans for the Manhattan Project were already in the works by 1939, but an attack on the Philippine Islands instead of Pearl Harbor may have prolonged Japan's defense against the Americans. America's confidence would have taken a severe toll after a potential string of defeats against the Japanese, and World War II may have been dragged on for much longer than it did. But that doesn't matter, because World War II was replaced by the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was a 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The two superpowers had been racing to create the greatest military in the world since 1947, and it was during these tense weeks that Americans lived in fear of losing the lives of everyone they loved at the push of a button. As President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev scrambled to negotiate the removal of a nuclear warhead from communist Cuba and Turkey, a decision regarding a big red button was made below the water's surface. A Soviet submarine deployed to Cuba carrying a 15-ton nuclear torpedo was signaled by American depth charges to surface, but the submarine commander was pressured by his political officer to fire the torpedo, thinking that nuclear warfare had already begun. The submarine only needed the approval of one more man, Captain Vasily Arkhipov, to fire the torpedo, and Arkhipov said no. The world avoided a nuclear doomsday as both the United States and Soviet Union agreed to withdraw their missiles. So what if Arkhipov said yes? Any attempt at a diplomatic resolution between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev would have been thwarted as the 15-ton nuclear torpedo detonated and destroyed the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. The United States Air Force already had a plan in place to invade Cuba, so they would have sent hundreds of sorties to wipe out the missile sites in Cuba. The United States would have responded by deploying their overwhelming nuclear arsenal against Russia and Warsaw Pact countries. Over 1,000 bombers, 3,000 nuclear bombs, 208 ballistic missiles, and multiple nuclear missile submarines armed with over 100 missiles would have been called to action. daily losses on both sides would have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and entire countries would have been reduced to rubble.
You have